But I'll first just say, Sego Sewa Guego. Hello, everyone. My name is Llewellyn White, and I am Ganyangahaga, a Mohawk from Akwesasne, and I am a descendant of Carlisle Indian School former students. My grandfather was at Carlisle. So welcome to the 4th biennial Carlisle Journeys Conference that is hosted by the Cumberland County Historical Society in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. If you'd like to have more information about Carlisle Journeys, our past conferences, you can go to carlislejourneys.org. And tonight I would like to introduce you, I'm not the speaker, I'm introducing Dr. Denise Lajimodiere. So I'll just say a few words and then hand it over to Denise, and she'll speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we will have about 15 minutes for questions. So I would just like to welcome my friend and sister, Denise Lajimodiere. Denise is an enrolled citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa in Belcourt, North Dakota. She's been involved in education for quite some time as a teacher, a principal, professor, and she earned her undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of North Dakota. She's a retired professor from the School of Education at North Dakota State University in Fargo. She is one of the founding members of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And Denise is also a poet. She's written several poetry books, Dragonfly Dance, Thunderbird, Bitter Tears, and the upcoming new book of poetry called His Feathers Were Chains. She's also a children's book author. Coming out in 2021 is a book called Josie Dances. And Denise is also a traditional jingle dress dancer. She's a birch biting artist, and she currently lives in Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota. And tonight, Denise is going to be talking about her book called Stringing Rosaries, The History, the Unforgivable, the Healing of Northern Plains Boarding School Survivors. So I will turn it over to Denise.
Mingwich, yep, zooming in from beautiful Turtle Mountains. I say I live by a cozy cottage here by the lake. In a beautiful fall day, sunny, leaves are changing and falling. I need to read this to you before I start with my presentation. For many, these topics here can recall painful memories. Feelings of anger, sadness, or disbelief are understandable and warranted. I caution readers this presentation may trigger responses in you related to your own trauma and possibly painful family history. If what is revealed here brings up emotional pain for you, I encourage you to seek support or help from a trusted source. Okay, so my interest in boarding schools began with my family. My father, my mother, and all of my grandparents were sent to boarding schools. So I'll talk a little bit about my research in just a minute. I'll give a really brief history. It's like 500 years of history in 2 minutes. So I'm not going to go back through all of the American history up until the boarding school era. But the U.S. had an Indian problem. It became too expensive to keep the attempted genocide of indigenous people. The Army said it cost about almost $1 million for each campaign or battle waged against native peoples. So in 1869, President Grant announced his Indian peace policy, which allowed religious denominations to undertake the work of civilizing the Indian. The Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions established boarding schools both on and off reservations. And some of the other denominations were Methodists, Orthodox Friends, Presbyterian, Episcopalians, Hicksite Friends, Baptist, Reformed Dutch Church, Congregationalists, Unitarians, and Lutherans and Quakers. They all ran boarding schools throughout the United States. In 1891, Congress authorized the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to enforce compulsory attendance of Indian children and to withhold rations clothing, and other annuities from parents or guardians who refused to send or keep their children in school. So it was a forced removal, and I call it the stolen generation. And I use my father as an example. He was raised by a Cree family just south of here on the reservation, and he was born in 1916, and his mom died in the 1918 flu epidemic. So he was raised by an older Cree couple, and they hid him in the bush until he was 9 years old. And the agents finally, with this law, they said that they would withhold rations and food and even wood. And in North Dakota, when it gets 80 below zero wind chill, the old couple certainly would have died. So he was sent to, so then they, Carlisle was the first off-reservation federal boarding school in 1879. And I sure wish we were all there in Carlisle and could tour the school again. And then Richard Pratt had a buddy from the Civil War, and his last name was Wilkinson. And he started a school. He asked Captain Pratt if he could start a school out on the West Coast, and he started a school called Chemawa in 1880 out in Oregon. So that's where my father was sent. There were 6 kids that were sent from here in 1925, and there was another 6 sent the year before. So they traveled all the way from North Dakota, little guys, very young as 5 years old, 4 years old, sent that far away from home. Some of the other schools that my family was sent to were the people from the Northern Plains. Besides Carlisle, my great-grandfather's brother was sent to Carlisle. Fort Taunton, which is just about 90 miles down the road here. Wahpeton, North Dakota, and that's about 4 hours south of here. Marty, South Dakota, and Steuben. So Fort Taunton and Wahpeton were federal boarding schools, and Marty and Steuben were Catholic boarding schools. Wahpeton is still operating. Yeah. So it was interesting after visiting Carlisle, Fort Taunton. The buildings look the same because Fort Taunton is it's not being used as a fort anymore like Carlisle is, but the buildings look exactly the same how they were built. So what I did as a professor, you know, we have to have a research agenda, and I had done my dissertation on Native women and their path to leadership. And when you do a qualitative interview dissertation, there's certain themes that sort of bubble up from there's a complicated way of coming up with the themes. And one of the themes of all the Native women that I interviewed was boarding school. So I took off in that vein after listening to my parents and my mom and so on talk about boarding schools. I decided to do a qualitative interview study of boarding school survivors. So I had put something in newspapers, tribal newspapers throughout North Dakota, and people, survivors answered from South Dakota, Minnesota, and here in North Dakota. So again, themes kind of bubbled up from the interviews, and I'll go over each one of them along with some vignettes of the survivors. So of course, one of the major themes was the experience of loss of identity. Pratt and friends of the Indians, they were rabid assimilationists. So he believed, let's see, where is that? His beliefs were that he agrees with the sentiment at the time that was the only good Indian was a dead Indian, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. And that, of course, is a very familiar saying for Native people. So, of course, and he ran his school's military style, and we'll talk more about that. So there was a great loss of identity. They were shamed and ridiculed and punished. And then, of course, loss of language. So many of my people, of the survivors that I interviewed, didn't speak English when they went to school. And most of these were about 60 and older. My auntie was the oldest. I think she was 95 at the time I interviewed her. And so Josephine said that they put lye soap in her mouth, and my dad said the same. The nuns would have little bits of lye soap left over during the day, and they would put it in the children's mouth and hold their lips shut, or until they would get blisters in their mouth, or they would have to blow bubbles. She said that When I was 5 years old, I was put on a bus that took me to St. Joseph's. I didn't speak English very well. They lined us up and asked my grandparents' name was, what their name was. I said, Mushum and Cookum, which is Cree for grandpa and grandma. The nun hit me over the head and knocked me to the floor. And my mom said that when she got to Stevan, she didn't speak English either, and they would lock her in the closet. But she said, I didn't care. I liked it in the closet. So I suppose, they left her alone. But if she peed her pants, and they'd drag her out, and then they would beat her for that. But she would come home, and she'd be speaking English, and my grandmother would tell her to talk like a human being, talk Indian, talk our tribal language. So I grew up with my grandmother speaking our tribal language to my mom, but my mom never spoke the language again. She spoke English back to grandma, and my dad never spoke Cree again for the rest of his life. So they would cut the hair, of course, cut the braids. They would instantly put kerosene. One of the survivors said our scalp would just burn. A lot of them described DDT that they would put in their hair after they would get their hair cut off. A white powder, which of course was DDT. So another theme, of course, was loss of culture, ceremonies, or traditions. They were rabid assimilationists. They didn't allow any type of culture or ceremony or any traditions, of course, at the school. Loss of self-esteem. Julia said, the teacher made me feel ashamed for being Indian, and that is still with me today. So that was across the board with all of the survivors. I interviewed about 25, and 16 interviews made it into the book. So some students internalized boarding school messages that told them to feel ashamed of their identities, parents, and communities, internalized oppression or self-hate. The kids, one of the roughest things to hear from the survivors was loneliness. My dad said that they woke up once and the dorms were, they were overcrowded. The schools were overcrowded. And the dorms, the beds were put very close together, and a boy had died. And I said, well, Papa, what did he die of? And he said he died of loneliness. So I was talking to a nurse, psychiatrist, and she said that's like failure to thrive. They would just quit eating and they would die of loneliness. All of them felt abandoned by their parents. There's a lot of different reasons why kids went to boarding school, but those that were taken are forced or are taken by social workers away from their parents. Roger said, when I was younger, I always wondered why my parents hated me. Why did they do that to me? Send me there. So some that I interviewed, their cousins went, so they wanted to go. Others, they literally were starving. Catholicism came into our people, and no birth control. So some of the families I interviewed had 14 kids. And even my grandmother, she had 4 kids, and my grandfather abandoned them, and she couldn't support them. So she had to send them to boarding school to feed them. And others, like I said, chose to go. But once they got there, and the harsh punishment and the horrific food and so on, they didn't know what they were getting themselves into. So this is one of the, this is all pretty tough to relate to or to talk about, but what's pretty well known is the corporal punishment. Pratt used he had a military background, of course, so his school was run like the military. Military discipline. They marched everywhere. My dad said at Chimawa they had revelry every morning about 5 o'clock, and they would get up and they had to march. He marched with a little wooden gun when he was little, and as he got older, they had regular metal guns that they would have to march with. And they had bells and they whistles. One survivor, I think Tommy, he said that the guys that were had to watch the boys in the dorm, they would wake them up by throwing these tin garbage cans, making that's how the kids woke up. So one thing they did at Fort Taunton when I was interviewing several elders here was that they're elders now, but as boys they said there was something called the dungeon. And they said it was underneath the boys' dorm and that they would get put in there for not speaking English. So I spent a lot of time at Fort Taunton, and there was a changeover of people that worked there. It's a historical site, and there was two younger people, one native gal and another younger man that worked there. And they were more willing to let me run all over, go all kinds of places at the fort that wasn't available or tourists weren't allowed to go. So I told them about this dungeon. So they came with me, and we found two underneath the boys' dorm. And one of them was way in the back where the boys would have gone to shower, and it had a real thick wooden cover to it. So we had to have flashlights and so on. So we lifted that up, and sure enough, there was a ladder that went down. So I had them go down there, and then I put the cover on top and asked them, because the boys all said that it was pitch black in there. And they said, yeah, it was pitch black. And so then there was another dungeon that was underneath the boy. As you go up the boys' dorm, there was one that was underneath there also. And then I interviewed, I talked to Olive Gord. He wouldn't let me be interviewed, and he wouldn't come to Fort Taunton. But he said across the Cavalry Square to where it would have been a captain's house, or it would have been the superintendent's house when it changed from the army into a boarding school. And he said, look under there. He said, you'll find another dungeon where he was thrown. And so we moved furniture and we lifted up old rugs because this place is being remodeled. And sure enough, we could see an outline of a square. So we got some tools and we opened it up, and sure enough, there were steps that went down there too. So these kids were literally put in dungeons. And then there was something called the Gauntlet. And this was pretty common in all of the schools in Canada and in the United States and Catholic boarding schools, where if you did something wrong, they would line up the boys and you would have to run through or crawl on your hands and knees. And the boys on both sides would have belts or paddles, and they would have to hit you as hard as they could. And if anybody let up, you would have to take their place. So my dad said that they killed a boy from Browning, Montana with the Gauntlet. They ruptured his kidneys. My dad went through the Gauntlet. It's a longer story, but he was put through the Gauntlet, and the boys beat him. He was about 9 years old with a belt, and he said it had studs in it. And he was in the hospital for 2 weeks in the infirmary, right there on campus, of course. So there was just no oversight in what happened to these kids. But he had to sleep on his stomach for 2 weeks. They tore him up pretty bad. So Cecilia said, when I first arrived at Wapton, I was 5 years old. A girl was on the swing and her foot accidentally hit the water. The matron beat her with a horsewhip on the legs and then her back. She was cut open and bleeding. Another survivor said, kneel on a broomstick. They make you kneel on the broomstick if you were bad. Oh God, that hurt. And you better not move because they would come over and pull your hair. This one, she talked about having to kneel on a broomstick, or I think it was a man, and hold his arms out, straight out to the side, and stay kneeling on the broomstick as long as they could. Tom says that I kneeled on a broomstick from 1 o'clock on Saturday to 4:30. If I tried to sit back, I got kicked in the ass. When I stood up, I could hardly stand. My tendons were just, oh God. Demas, some of these are not the real names of the people that I interviewed. So many of them said that they didn't want their relatives and their kids and their grandkids to know what they had been through. They said, I have to remember this every day, or I remember this every day of my life. I don't want my kids and my grandkids to ever know what happened to me. I don't want them to have to think about what happened to me. But Demas is down the road. He let me use his real name. So this is so sad. He said, for speaking Dakota, I had to kneel on a ruler with my hands in front of my face. If I tried to lean back and sit on my heels, Father would grab my hair and my scalp and hold it up straight. So he's an elder now, and he does ceremonies, but when he's called on in public to do a prayer, he won't talk his language in public. He'll speak to his wife. He said that whenever he speaks Dakota in public, he can still feel that pain in his scalp and his head, his hair. So he won't speak it in public to this day. It's called stress torture to do something like that for kids. They use that in the military. I think under Bush, it's called stress torture. So my dad said that in Chimawa, when the kids ran away, they strung strings over beams in the cafeteria, and they tied the little boys' hands to the strings, and then they pulled the rope up so that their little feet couldn't quite touch the floor. And again, a torture. And they do that in front of the kids as opposed to make an example so that other kids wouldn't run away. So they pitted kids against each other. I can't remember what the military name would be, but they had older kids that would be overlooking the younger ones. And they were pitted against each other. So an example is in one of my poetry books called Bitter Tears. This was a true story. The welcoming. An older boy was assigned to my guide. He took me to the second floor of the dorm, reached out and shoved me back down the concrete stairs. He looked at me and said, "Welcome to boarding school. Now get over it." So older kids were used to discipline the younger ones. And so another common discipline would be for bedwetters, and they always shame them out. They'd make them put the wet sheet over their heads. They would march them, wrap them around them, and march them into the cafeteria in front of all the kids. This one, Catherine said that she would get the wooden paddle for wetting the bed, and the wooden paddle had holes in it. And I understand that causes more pain. She said that it hurt so bad that the kids couldn't sit down. She couldn't sit down. She also said that she'd get her face rubbed in the pea sheets. And they used kids against each other. And one story was that the nuns or the matrons found in the closet a pea-stained sheet, and no one would own up to it. So she asked the older girls, "What should we do to discipline whoever? No one's coming forward." So the girls said, "Well, let's just pee in a bowl and we'll put their faces in it." And that's what they did. The older girls peed in the bowl, and then the matron took the younger girls and slammed their face in the bowl of pee. So once to Tommy, interesting story. He went to Pierre, South Dakota, and the disciplinary then, he got himself in trouble, and they had to run down by the river and get their own willow switch. So he said he was running down the river, and when he got close to the river, he ran into like a nest of rattlesnakes. And he's a little guy, he's 7, 8 years old. He said he jumped as high as he could, and he went over the snakes, got his switch, and then just threw rocks, and so that the snakes would get out of his way, and went back and gave the teacher the switch. And she didn't just switch him right then. She waited until all the boys were together in the dorm, and then she beat him with the switch in front of all the rest of the kids. So, of course, another commonality was sickness and illness. There was trachoma, TB, measles, hepatitis, lice, chickenpox. So because they were crammed so close together in the dorms, when one child caught mumps or something, then all of it just went through the dorm. Research shows that many died at school or soon after returning from schools, and many were sent home to die. In Canada, they were starting to look at the boarding school era and look at records within each of the towns that the kids on the reservation, and looking at the death records to try to do research on how many kids died after they were sent home from school. When I went to Chimawa, I went to the cemetery there, and I went to look at the years that my dad was there, from 1925 to 1930, and all the kids that were buried there during those years. And he went into carpentry, so he did work his entire life as a carpenter. But there was a lot of kids that were buried during the years that he was there, and I always wonder if he had to build the caskets for these kids, especially say the kid that died, that went through the gauntlet, did he blame himself for maybe killing that kid? And did he have to build the casket for that boy? So the schools were overcrowded and they were underfunded. The government never gave the schools enough money to support the number of kids there. So they didn't provide funds for new buildings or for maintenance. Or the solution was to have the kids build and repair the buildings, maintain the barns, gardens, clean, cook, laundry, sewing. They acted as janitors and they worked in the barns and fields. So the kids worked half a day and they went to school half a day. I was interviewing my auntie who has since passed away. Her name is Mary. The family let me use her name. And she was at Fort Taunton. We were outside and she just kind of had her hands in the air. And I thought, what was the schedule like? Well, boarding school was extremely scheduled. Every minute of your day was scheduled. And she said, on Mondays we did laundry. On Tuesdays we did the ironing. And then she went, when were we in school? So, and just because they worked in the barn or the gardens, they sold those vegetables and they sold that milk and so on to outside the school to support it. The kids didn't get, fresh vegetables or fruit. Yep. So they were always hungry. They ate a lot of slop. A lot of them talked about eating food that had worms in it. One young man was lactose intolerant. They got raw milk from the cows, and he said they would barf, and I'm lactose intolerant. I can't. I can imagine. But then he said if any of the kids vomited, he saw one kid that got sick and vomited, and they tried to make him eat his vomit. And this is common again all across Canada. I heard this story over and over again from boarding school survivors from many schools. And he said that the kid would just vomit again, and so then the matron just rubbed his nose in it. I was listening to a tape, someone from UND, a professor retired, and they found some old tapes of boarding school people that were interviewed in the 70s. And one was a non-native lady that worked at the Bismarck boarding school here in North Dakota in Bismarck. And she said when she got there, the first day, she saw the kids were eating, and it looked like worms in their I don't know, cereal, whatever they were eating, flour, bread, whatever. And she went into the kitchen and she told them, you got to stop. There's bugs in this meal. And the non-native cook looked at her and said, oh, they're used to it. And she said that she eventually got fired because she just raised too much hell. But she said that there was a ham waiting there. It was just green with mold, with rot. And they were just cutting off the mold and going to serve it to the kids. So one of the things the kids had to do was send out begging letters to patrons far away out east. And this was the title of my book, Stringing Rosaries, where I got this title. And this is Genevieve. And she said, we got paid for stringing rosaries every day, like a penny. I mean, we got just dirt. It was like slave labor. They had these little white plastic rosaries, and you'd string them on a card, and they'd put those in those begging letters and send them out all across the country. They would choose the most pitiful, pathetic-looking Indian kids to paste on those begging letters and send those little rosaries out that we all had to string. You might get like a penny for 5 rosaries, and you wouldn't get actual money, but you'd get points to go to the candy store on Sunday. Yeah, so she hated it. She hated having to do those rosaries, and they had to be perfect, or they'd get slapped, or get their ears would get jerked so hard that they would bleed. So they're always hungry. Julia says, for breakfast they put a box of cereal on the table, and there was like 10 of us, and whoever got the end of the box, there was nothing there. They didn't get nothing. I was hungry all the time. And if you get some cereal, usually there's no milk in the pitcher by the time you got it. They gave us postum coffee. Now that's a it's not made anymore, I don't think. It's a powdered roasted grain beverage. It's a coffee substitute, but there's no caffeine in it. And another young man said, I stole a jar of cherries. I was hungry all the time. I got whipped with a razor strap. I had a choice of either the razor strap or a fiberglass fishing rod. So there was a question I never thought to ask my father or my mom or anyone. And in the protocol at the boarding school heating project, not NABS, but the before NABS was a boarding school heating project, they had a question protocol in it. They asked about sexual and mental abuse. So it's a question I asked the survivors. One survivor said that they would be in the gym and a priest would hand a ball to him and said, pick a boy and hit him with the ball. So he did. And to his horror, that priest took the boy out and molested him. The next day, the priest would come back and pick that same boy and tell him, pick a boy, hit a boy with the ball. And to his horror, to this day, he kept hitting the same boy because he didn't want any of the other boys to have to go through that. So he has to live with that. Roger said the sex abuse would happen at night when all of us were sleeping. The brothers would come in and take someone out. When the boys would come back, they would be crying. They didn't want to be touched, and they were always scared. No one ever talked about it. Josephine said, I remember having to serve the priest wine. The nuns would bring me to the priest's room, but I don't remember ever leaving. Did he get me drunk? I had a lot of problems down there. The priest, not a nun, would bring me to the doctor. She was 6 years old. To this day, I don't like being touched, hugs and stuff, people holding me. Julia said she was molested by 2 different priests. The nuns would come and get her. She figured they chose her because she didn't have friends and was a loner. If another priest came into the room, the molesting priest would hide her in a closet. There was also the boys, Tommy, the one that had to run down and get his switch and ran into the rattlesnakes. That same lady would watch them take a shower. And these were young boys to older boys, like 10, 11, 12 years old. She would watch them shower, and then when they lined up, they'd have to go in front of her, lift their towel up over their head, and spin around while she inspected their genitalia. It was pretty embarrassing for them because they were older boys. So the sad thing that started happening is that the older boys started molesting younger boys, throughout the United States, and even girls were molesting some of the younger girls. So they had, another thing was that they had an inferior education. Of course, if they only went to school for half a day, I'm sorry, I have to keep messing with this thing. If they only went to school for half a day, they didn't get a very good education. So I've been asked a few times, almost angrily, well, my grandma said she had a good time at boarding school. So what I usually say to them is that we have to think about what was going on in Indian country, historically, what was going on. We were being put on reservations. Our hunting and fishing rights were being taken away. We were given commodity food, often just slop. I remember them when I was younger. So how sad is it that things were so horrific at home that this hellhole called boarding schools would be considered a better place than at home? There was also, alcoholism, and some of the kids were being molested at home by uncles and grandparents. So yeah, they had a bed, they had running water. As bad as the food was, they did have food. And the other thing I need to remind them is that the overarching policy was forced assimilation and forced Christianity. So coming to the end, some of the theories I read about that were new to me as I was doing this research was words like historical unresolved grief theory. And that results from the historical trauma of genocide, grief that has not been expressed, acknowledged, or resolved. It also refers to unsettled distress that results from being kept from engaging in traditional practices and ceremonies, and it can span across generations. There's disenfranchised grief. I call it unresolved grief also. Grief that can't be publicly mourned. So there was one of the elder men, he looked at me and he said, when do you talk to your family about being molested or sodomized at boarding school? When do you mention that? Thanksgiving dinner? So it's something that so many of the especially the women that were sexually molested, that they had never talked about it. One of them said, I've not told anybody and I don't know why I'm telling you. She was whispering in this big house all by herself. And I said, I know why. I asked. So no one's asked the boarding school survivors, what happened to them. Are they, or asked them about their sexual abuse. One lady, she was in her mid 70s. And she said that she had spent 5 weeks recently in a psychiatric ward because things were starting to come unstuffed, her memories of being molested by that priest. But she said, I never told the priest, I never told her psychiatrist and her counselors there. She said, what would they think of me? I should have fought harder against him. She was 5 years old, but she felt ashamed in that she felt that she should have done something more to stop this priest from molesting her. Wow, so sad. But she wouldn't even let me return. When I would interview you and then have it transcribed, and I would send you a copy of your interview, and then you can add or delete anything you wanted. And 2 of my interviewees, they said, don't send it. Like I said earlier, they didn't want anybody in their family to ever come upon it, even accidentally. So there's an incredible document that just came out last year, done, it's by Native American Rights Fund, and it's called Trigger Points. And it's 104 pages, but I encourage you to look this up, download it. It's remarkable in the amount of information that's on there. So they talk about something called boarding school syndrome, and this is what's happened to many of my interviewees. PTSD, including recurring intrusive memories, nightmares, flashbacks, detachment disorder, deficient knowledge of traditional culture and cultural skills, trouble sleeping, poor anger management, deficient parent skills, tendency to abuse alcohol or drugs. And that's one thing that helped me understand doing this research, was understand my parents, especially my dad. Where did my parents learn to be parents? Mama was in boarding school till she was in high school. Papa till, he came home when he was 9, 10, 11. He was like 14 when he came home. And then he ran away and eventually ended up in the CCC camps and then in World War II. So where did he ever learn to be a parent? Where were they ever hugged, or where were they ever loved? So Dad disciplined us the way he was disciplined, with the belt, and Mom would make us kneel in the corner. We didn't have to kneel on a broomstick, but we'd have to kneel in the corner for 30 minutes at a time. So, and then my dad turned to alcohol. So research now, we know that boarding schools has left a legacy of adverse childhood experience, and it disrupts brain, leading to higher likelihood of negative health outcomes as an adult, including heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and autoimmune disease. We suffer from disproportional cycles of violence, abuse, disappearance, health disparities, substance abuse, premature death, and undocumented trauma, psychological trauma. So there's something called epigenetics, which I don't know anything about. Someone else would have to chat with you about that, but it has to do with DNA. So I think of my great grandma, who I knew well, who I remember. She was involved in the Indian Wars. My uncle said, he's 96. And so then she sent her 4 boys to boarding school. One of them, my grandfather sent my mom to boarding school, and my parents wouldn't send us off to boarding school. But I think of the legacy of the Indian Wars and then boarding school, and what is in my DNA and in my epigenetics. So that's interesting. So I do, okay, 6:45. I do want to, I don't want to leave you with, Trigger Points they did a wonderful research on healing. And so just real quick, because if you read the document, they look at healing across Indian nation as our language and education, increased economic opportunities, research and scholarship, focus on family programs, focus on health and well-being. And the people I interviewed said they would like to see an apology from the government, a return to tribal spirituality, forgiveness, and of course, therapy. And then the coolest thing, I was so excited. I know Lou is excited too. The Democrats introduced a bill addressing cultural genocide against Native Americans. So Representative Deb Haaland is from New Mexico. So they're going to establish a bill that would establish a Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding school policy in the United States. I'm so excited. So I hope it goes through, and then I hope I can get myself put on this commission. I'm so excited about this. Lou was going to ask me about the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. In 2011, we got together with Native American Rights Fund, NARF, and other programs across the country that work with boarding school or work with healing. And we came up with the Boarding School Healing Coalition. And of course, our main focus is on healing. And so now, finally, from 2011 to now, we've got this bill. So I'm so excited about this. I'm so happy that this is going to happen. Okay, Lou.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Denise. It is 7:47, so we want to make sure to let everyone go on time. So we have a few minutes. If there's questions for Denise, you can put them in the chat. I think that's the best way. If there's any other way to do that, Kara, please pop in and let us know. Otherwise, you can put your question in chat. And we have a couple of minutes. If I see a question, I will relay it to Denise so that she doesn't have to scroll through chat. Okay, I don't see anything yet. Yep. So what I will do is I will ask a question for Denise, and if you have a question, if there's time, I'll monitor the chat box.
Right.
And I see Denise is flashing us with a beautiful map, and Christina did just post a question that maybe you can address. If, yes, now there's many questions.
Okay, cool, good. All right, go for it.
Christina is asking, have the boarding schools acknowledged the dungeons? And Paula is asking, is the return of the remains of children part of the healing process? So that's a big question. So I'll let you decide how you want to answer those, including also sharing a bit about your map. Yeah.
No, the boarding schools haven't. It's people like me that have to do the research to hear the survivors talk about the boarding schools and then go find them. Fort Taunton brings people, I think, visitors now back to the dungeon now that we found it. But that's just one school out of I have now 386 schools. So no, Carlisle is starting to repatriate some of the bodies to families of certain tribes that want their not the bodies but the remains repatriated, and I'm not part of that. There's others that were part of that, but there are some that have been repatriated, and yes, that would be part of the healing. There's some tribes that their spirituality says keep the kids there. There's other tribes that said their spirits need to be returned home. So I don't know, Chamawa alone has 225 graves that Marcia Small found, and there was even graves on top of graves, and then there were some unmarked graves. And none of them have been repatriated yet, so I don't know. I think Alaska is scheduled the next one to go to Carlisle and repatriate some of the kids there, bring them home.
Thank you, Denise. Would you like to talk about your map a little bit and share?
I thought there was another question. I thought I saw someone pop up with another question.
Oh yes, there is. Jim. Hi, Jim. Jim Garencher. He's asking, having already been aware of how bad things were at the boarding schools, were there any stories you heard that surprised you?
Wow, I'd have to go back through all of my, I didn't expect the sexual abuse. I guess I was naive and innocent. I was stunned and shocked. There's something called secondary trauma. I would be pretty shook up after some of these interviews, and I'd have to put it away for a while. I think the longest I put the manuscript away was for a year. And I only do these talks about once every 6 months because this is hard on me. So I think, yeah, it was hard, but I don't know about any specific surprises.
Thank you, Denise. I don't see any further questions, so if you want to share anything else.
Yes, the map. On the back of the book is a map, and it's going to be updated when the book comes out as a paperback. There's 366 schools that I found, and I found 20 more since the book has been published. But what happened was I was an outside observer, an international observer of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's process up in Canada. And they brought me up to Whitehorse, Yukon. And as we had a working supper that night, the commissioners, Willie and Marie and Chief Justice Murray, they looked at me, Chief Justice Murray looked at me and he said, well, how many boarding schools do you have in the United States? And I'm representing the United States at that point, and a professor, I couldn't answer him. It was, they knew exactly how many boarding schools, they knew exactly how many people were still alive, boarding school survivors. There was 80,000. They had 40,000 people come forward and tell their story. I have 16 in this book. They had like $5 billion to do their reconciliation. We had nothing when we started the boarding school healing coalition here in the United States. So I made it my goal to look for boarding schools. So I spent 12 years writing the book and also looking for boarding schools. And it was extremely frustrating and tedious and painstaking. But this is the only map in the United States and the only one that's done this research. So I'm pretty proud of this map. So it's 29 states. So as an example, no one has asked the Catholic Church, how many boarding schools did you run? And so I got a grant from my university and I spent a week at Marquette University. And the archivist there was kind of strange. He would bring out one box at a time and they'd have about 25 to 30 files, and there was 35 boxes. And I'd filter through them, you know, day school, boarding school. And day school, you know, they're even, in Canada, they're even having a class action suit against the day schools because they were also pretty bad. So anyway, so I went through these files painstakingly, looked at Catholic boarding schools. So that's the other, so that's what I had to do, sit there with white gloves on and dust and look through files from 1884 and find boarding schools, because Catholics, they're not even answering us. They're not answering, they don't have anything to do with us. And the other organization, church, is the Quakers. They did their own research. She came to NABS, we gave her a grant, and she did her own research about boarding, the boarding schools. But you know, they don't have like a pope, so they can't issue an apology for all the Quakers. They just have individual churches. But I'm so grateful for them for having done their own research. That was a gal named Paula. So yeah, so a lot has been written about Carlisle, many books. There's even a movie being made because of Jim Thorpe. But every one of these, you know, where do we go from here next? Well, there's all kinds of research that needs to be done on each one of these schools. A book needs to be written about every one of these schools, not just Carlisle. All of these schools need to have their documents scanned and available to boarding school survivors that are still alive today. So we still have a lot of research to do. And NABS recently got a $10 or $11 million grant, and that's part of what they're doing, is looking for documents, finding the boarding schools again. What years did they operate? How many kids were there, and what denomination ran them? So they're busy working on these 386 schools, just trying to find that information. And I know Lou did some research with, I'll let you talk about it, Lou. What's just the research that you were doing with Carlisle?
Yes, I was looking in the last couple of years for children who died when they were on outings in the summertime. They would
describe,
be sent off.
Tell what the outings were.
In the summertime, students would be sent to work for with white families, farms, and some like industries. And what I was finding in some of the previous research that I was doing regarding my family, I saw that there were some who died when they were on outings, but they weren't in the school cemetery and didn't look like they were sent home according to what records I could find. So I was searching for where they were, and some of them were in Quaker cemeteries and public cemeteries, and so I looked for about 12, but I know there are more, and so I'm continuing to do that work as well. And I know how difficult it is, and in what you've been sharing tonight, Denise, especially listening to survivor stories, and you talked about that secondary like PTSD. We just have a couple of minutes, and I'm wondering if you could maybe say two things. One is, how do you take care of yourself when you have to carry these stories with you? I'm glad you said that you pace yourself and you do these talks about once every 6 months. I wonder if there's anything else. And then maybe before we go, if you can let people know where they might be able to view the map that you created, if that's on NAP's website, or and what I would also say is that would be a good opportunity for people to look in their own areas to see where there are boarding schools in your state, in your region, in your county.
Yeah, that's how I found some of the new ones, the 20 new ones. Someone popped one up on, just totally unrelated to me. I saw they posted about a boarding school in their town, and I didn't have it on the map. So it's totally serendipitous. But my tribal spirituality, sweat lodge ceremonies, we have, wipe away the tear ceremony, because I'd sit outside and just cry before I could carry on. And I would go to Minnesota or South Dakota, wherever these people were, wherever they were comfortable with, I would go. Then I would just sob all the way back to the university or to my home. So ceremonies, Sundance, they have a healing ceremony that we do, and then plus just taking breaks. But what these survivors told me is, they please tell the world what happened to us. And I always think about the Holocaust survivors are starting to pass away, and so are some of these older boarding schools. Many of my 5 that I've interviewed have already passed away. They're in their 80s and 90s. And I don't want the world, well, first of all, we need to tell the world. This is America's best kept secret. So I want to tell the world what happened to boarding school, during the boarding school era. So I'll do this till I can't do it anymore. I'm continuing to interview people that want their stories told. So that's what keeps me going, is these elders that said, please tell the world what's happening to us. So it keeps me strong.
Thank you, Denise. I missed a question. There's just quickly one from Colleen. Colleen, who asks, is there still a boarding school in use?
In where?
Is there still a boarding school that is open, that exists today?
There are 54 boarding schools still operating, but they're run by tribes now. They have oversight of tribal governments. Wahpeton, Chemawa is actually the oldest operating boarding school. It's over 100 years old. So do the math from 1880 to now. It's still operating. It's a high school. Flandreau is still operating here in South Dakota, and Wahpeton is still here. Pierre is still going. There's many schools in the Southwest, because the kids, the Navajos are 100 miles from, and 200, 500 miles from the nearest school. So they do board during the week and then go home. But that's a different type of situation. But the Bureau of Indian Affairs is still running boarding schools, and Chemawa's had a lot of problems. It gets investigated every now and then. It they can't keep principals. There's still a lot of issues at Chimawa.
Great. Thank you so much. It is 8 o'clock and we're out of time. Just quickly, there's a lovely comment from Martha who says, thank you for your honesty and grace. And she's familiar with a bit of what's happened in Canada. And an interesting comment that she made, that her grandmother taught English at the Haskell Institute in the early 1900s.
Wow.
She traveled from Lawrence, where she taught Latin at her classes.
Yeah.
And her grandmother gave her some of the gifts of beading that she received, but they sadly were destroyed in a house fire. So the map is on boarding school healing. Is it in the book? And
but yeah, it's a pullout in the book. So I encourage you to buy the book. It's on Amazon, or it's North Dakota State University Press, and then it's a pullout that the editor was just a genius, and you can pull it out and put it on your wall. But yeah, so it's in the book. But I think the one on NABS is not updated. I'm working with Samuel, a new hire there. He's been there a year. I just talked to him this week, and we're working on updating the map between schools that he has found and the 20 that I found. And then we'll update the map online.
Okay, great. So buy the book.
It's a bonus in the book.
Yes.
It's a pull-out poster.
Get the book and pace yourself when you're reading. It's very difficult material, as you can, as you heard tonight. And the map, as Denise was describing, you can find it on the boardingschoolhealing.org website, and that is the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition that Denise was co-founding board member of. So that is boardingschoolhealing.org, and you can find Denise's book. It's on Amazon and North Dakota State University.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. All right, wonderful. Okay, thank you so much. Denise, it's been a pleasure.
Good to see you.
You too. I'm going to go smudge before I go to bed after hearing difficult stories. But again, I would encourage everyone to do more research and keep finding out more information, especially look at your own state, your county, your town, your area, to see were there boarding schools there. Maybe there were outings. Maybe there were children that were sent to work on outings in your area because they were sent all over the place.
Yeah, they were.
And if you would like more information about Carlisle Journeys, you can go to carlislejourneys.org. carlislejourneys.org. Hopefully we will be back in person next year.
Yay, or 2 years from now, yeah.
Yes, right, biennial. And thank you all for coming out, even if you're sitting at home in your comfy PJs. Thank you for all tuning in tonight. Kara, is there anything else?
No, I just wanted to follow up. Thank you for tuning in virtually and bearing with what this year of 2020, and nothing one is planned, but I'm glad we could continue to have these conversations even if we couldn't do it together like we intended.
Yeah, just spread the information to your people. Just exponentially we'll get the word out about what happened to our people and how it's still affecting us. It's still a terrible legacy within Indian nations today. So thank you very much, Kara, for your invitation.
Yes, thank you all.
And thank you, Barb.
Thank you all, and good evening. Have a good night.
Good night. Good night, Lou. Good night.